Hey, Jacksonville Presbyterian Church, it's Pastor Dustin, and it is Wednesday, May 19th, and I'm so excited to be back with our Wednesday night Bible study. So if you don't already have it, go grab your Bible and open up to the book of First Chronicles. So it was great to be back in the pulpit after being gone for I think it was a couple of Sundays over the last 3 weeks. It was great to be back and to see everybody. It was a beautiful service. Thank you for coming, for anybody who did. And thank you for tuning in tonight and staying plugged in online in our Bible study. If you weren't there in person, we are thinking and praying for you, and I hope to see you soon one day. So with that, let's open up to the book of First Chronicles. Before we do that, just a couple of quick things that I wanted you to be aware of. Number one, VBS is going to be here sooner than we think. We are running a vacation Bible school from June 21st to June 24th. We need you to bring your kids or maybe your grandkids or neighborhood kids if you would like. And then, of course, we're going to need all kind of volunteers and help with that. So hopefully you're excited about Vacation Bible School being back and you want to be involved. Also, if you are tuning in to the Ephraim Co-op, our daily devotional that's available online on our website and on our app, the Jayville Pres app, you'll know that every day we are reading a chapter of the book that we just preached on. So today, we were reading in, I think it was First Chronicles 15 or 16. And the song this week, if you have a chance to listen to it, I'd really encourage you to, because it may be one of my favorite hymns of all time, "Oh God, Beyond All Praising." So just, if you get a chance, pull up your app, listen to the song this week. It's really, really beautiful. And then, just two things going on in the life of the church to remind you of. We have a baby bottle drive right now for the pregnancy center here in the Rogue Valley. And so all we're asking people to do is pick up a baby bottle on Sunday, fill it with cash and coins over the next couple of weeks, and then bring it to church on Father's Day. And someone from the pregnancy center will collect all the bottles, and that'll be our donation drive for the pregnancy center and the amazing work that they do in our valley. And then lastly, I know this is a lot, but this Sunday at 4:30, you're welcome to meet us out back in our beautiful back field for some relay games, maybe some kickball and some pizza afterward. And then at 6 o'clock, we're going to have our family prayer and praise night. So it's a relaxed time to just hang out, have some fun outside, eat some food together, and then worship and hear some testimonies from people. So if you haven't been to one of those things on Sunday night, I'd really encourage you to check it out. So all that to say, a lot of things going on in the life of the church. If you don't get the weekly e-newsletter, you are missing out, and we hope to see you soon. All right, let's flip over now to the book of Chronicles. So as I mentioned on Sunday, when you and I get to the book of Chronicles, we have to remember that Chronicles, First and Second Chronicles, were really one book originally. And a long time ago, because it was such a long book, somebody split it up. And so we know it as First Chronicles and Second Chronicles, but really it's one combined book. Just like Samuel is really one book and Kings is really one book. And also, for the record, Ezra and Nehemiah used to be the same book. But, just for the sake of, making it in more digestible amounts and stuff, and because I think of the length of scrolls, it got split in two. But if you look at First Chronicles, it really does have a really basic outline. So if you open up to First Chronicles and you go to chapter 1, the basic outline is pretty simple. Chapters 1 through 9 are the genealogies, right? So if you remember on Sunday, that's where I said this is the part of the Bible in the Old Testament people get really nervous about, because it's, a genealogy and stuff. And, how boring could a genealogy be? We get bogged down in this. But there's a couple of things I'm going to point out to you about the genealogy that I think will make it a little bit more accessible. But after the genealogy stuff, starting in chapter 10 through 29, this is pretty much the story of the life of David. Now, of course, it begins with Saul, but that's because Saul and David are so intertwined in the beginning of David's life. He marries Saul's daughter, and, Saul's the one who doesn't fight Goliath, and David does. But notice that starting in chapter 10, it starts off with Saul, going in and dying, and David immediately being anointed king in Hebron. So All that to say, pretty simple outline. Sort of chapters 1 through 9, genealogy stuff, 10 through 29, the life of David. So before we skip over the genealogies, what are we supposed to notice? Well, if you go to 1 Chronicles 1:1, you'll know that it starts with Adam, the first man, and it works its way, sort of through the modern day of the author. The other thing I want to point out to you, though, about the genealogy is if you get into Chronicles chapter 3, we get the descendants of David, which is sort of a foreshadowing, right, for the rest of the book of 1 Chronicles, which is all about David. So why does he go out of his way to tell us the descendants of David? Well, because David's going to be the main character for this book. And then in chapter 4, something interesting happens where he starts to go through the genealogies of all the different tribes. So if you've got the English Standard Version, you'll know that there are these little like notes right here that kind of describe what each section is about. Those little like italicized titles are not a part of the original Bible, but they are put there so we can kind of have an idea of what this topic is. And if you look in chapter 4, it's very interesting because some of the tribes, I think 2 of the tribes are missing. And the order is not in the right order in terms of the birth order. So if you look in chapter 4, the first tribe we get is the tribe of Judah. But if you go way, way, way back in the Old Testament, you know that Judah was not the firstborn. But we know that Judah was always meant to have the ruler's scepter. And if you can think even further back in our Wednesday night Bible study, you may remember that when God's people were moving through the wilderness by stages, that they were organized in a really specific way where the Ark of the Covenant was, in the middle of the camp and the Levites surrounded it. And then there was a certain tribe that always faced in the direction they were going because it was the leadership position, and that was the tribe of Judah. So it makes sense that the chronicler, who is very pro-King David, would start off with Judah. And then what's even more interesting after you read, sort of chapter 4, is he goes Judah, Simeon, Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh. You see that in chapters 4 and 5, those sort of titles. So he mentions 5 tribes, with Judah being the first. And then in chapter 6, we get this long genealogy of the sons of Levi. It's longer than any other group. And then after Levi, we get 5 more tribes: Issachar, Benjamin, Naphtali, Manasseh, Ephraim, and Asher, right? So basically, if I'm counting that, maybe I counted that wrong, maybe it's 6, although Ephraim may be mentioned twice. If you notice, sort of, if you think about it, there's like a bunch of tribes here, and then the tribe of Levi is in the middle, and then a bunch of tribes are mentioned afterward. That is helping us see sort of how he's coming up with this list, because just like in the wilderness, the Levites were in the center around the ark. Now here, sort of the very center of his genealogy list centers on the Levites, who were primarily called for the right worship of God, which is exactly where Chronicles goes later on. So all that to say, this genealogy, we think of it as somewhat boring, but it's all actually building towards the overarching point, which is a focus on David and then a focus on proper worship. So with that in mind, let's now go into sort of chapters 10 through 29, right? So what's going on in the life of David? Well, like I said, it's a very simplified life of David. On Sunday I mentioned, there's a lot of things missing, like the story of Bathsheba is not in there. It's a very positive depiction of King David. But, the overarching theme seems to be, if he can focus on anything, he focuses on David's concern for the proper worship of God, right? So if you're into chapter 13, if you go down to verse 8, it mentions David and all Israel were rejoicing before the Lord with all their might, with song and lyres and harps and tambourines and cymbals and trumpets, right? So chapter 13 is all about the ark being brought from Kiriath Jearim, right? Kiriath Jearim. And sure enough, the author wants to remind us of all the beautiful different kind of instruments that people were using. And then, when we get into chapter 15, David is, wanting to, build his house, and he's talking about the Levites and how they need to carry the ark in a certain way. And that was what created the death of Uzzah. So again, there's that sense of, proper regard for God, proper administration of the word, proper worship. And then if you keep reading in chapter 15, we're introduced to a guy named Asaph. So if you go to 1 Chronicles chapter 15, verses 16 and 17, notice what it says. David commanded the chiefs of the Levites to appoint their brothers as the singers who should play loudly on musical instruments, on harps and lyres and cymbals, to raise sounds of joy. So the Levites appointed Heman, the son of Joel, and his brothers Asaph, the son of Berechiah, and of the sons of Merari, his brothers Ethan, and so on. So all that to say, I'm just pointing out a couple of times right off the bat where it seems like David is commended for his administrative ability to organize proper worship. And right there in chapters 15, when it mentions Asaph, this guy who is one of the worship leaders in Israel, you may recognize Asaph because he's the author of several Psalms. He's the author of, I think, Psalm 50, and then I think, if I am, my notes are right, I think it's Psalm 73 through 83, I believe, are the Psalms, the Psalms of Asaph. So again, we can see why the author is focusing so much on David, right? It's because he's concerned about the proper worship of God. And, if you read chapter 16, that's the same theme, right? David is seen as this organizer of proper worship. And the dream, the vision, right, is the global worship of the one true God. I preached on chapter 17, so you can go back and listen to that. But again, one way to understand the story about the temple is, where is the proper place for God to be worshiped? And how is David building towards proper worship by his military victories where he saves the silver and gold for the temple and so on. All of this is, again, showing us David's concern for the true worship of the one true God in line with his word. Right, so, you get into chapters, 19 and 20. 20, for me, is an interesting chapter because, once again, we are introduced to giants, and we're introduced to a guy with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. This is 1 Chronicles 20, verse 6. So I haven't talked about it in a few weeks, but remember, there's that whole thread in the tapestry of the Old Testament about the supernatural realm and the Rephaim or Nephilim or whatever you want to call it. And sure enough, here it is in Chronicles showing up again. All right, so that then leads the author, I don't really know what the connection is, but maybe this is like where his brain is going, is as he's thinking about, this sort of supernatural stuff. He then diverts his attention in chapter 21 to the census that David takes. And it's very interesting because in Chronicles it says that Satan is the one who incited David to go ahead and do this. And, remember, Chronicles is not depicting David as perfect, but it is commending him for his focus on proper worship. And so any idea that the chronicler sees David as perfect really is, dispelled in chapter 21 because David sins in making a census. And, God takes out, I think, 70,000. But it's very interesting the way that God does it. He sends an angel to do this for him. And David even sees the angel, on the threshing floor. So all that say, chapter 21 is a fascinating chapter. If I didn't preach on the covenant, I would have preached on chapter 21 probably because it's such an interesting chapter, right? Because we had just gotten the word about giants, and in chapter 21, we get this story about David falling into sin. Joab tries to warn him. And God says, okay, well, I'm going to send the angel of the Lord to punish you for 3 days. And we're introduced to that enigmatic figure, the angel of the Lord. And what's fascinating about this story not only that the angel of the Lord appears, but that David sees the angel of the Lord. And, what, like, sort of the next layer to this story, the way it sort of blows your mind, is if you're in chapter 21 and you go to verse 28. It says, go to maybe verse 26. He sees the angel of the Lord, and David built an altar to the Lord and presented burnt offerings and peace offerings and called on the Lord, and the Lord answered him with fire from heaven upon the altar. Then the Lord commanded the angel, and he put his sword back in its sheath. At that time, when David saw that the Lord had answered him at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, he sacrificed there. For the tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses had made in the wilderness, and the altar of burnt offering were at that time at Gibeon, but David couldn't go there because he was afraid of the sword of the angel of the Lord. Then David said, "Here shall be the house of the Lord God, and here the altar for the burnt offering." So what that means is, and where the author is taking this story, is that even though David failed in taking the census, even though he sinned, he rightfully repents. He pleads on behalf of people. And even despite David's sin, God uses that story to show David where the temple is supposed to be built. And it's on the threshing floor of Ornan, and David buys it, and he realizes this is now the place that God has chosen to be worshipped. And so even in sort of David's failure, even in his sin, God is using David to accomplish his purposes. And I just think there's something so profound in that's how we find where the Temple Mount is going to be. Pretty incredible, right? So, that's 1 Chronicles 22:1. And then as soon as he finds this is where to build the temple, he starts gathering, the resident aliens in the land to prepare to build the temple there. And, chapters 23 and 24, it kind of gets back to that theme of David as organizing proper worship with the Levites and the priests. In chapter 25, he organizes the musicians. So again, there's that focus on proper worship again. And the gatekeepers were a part of that. In chapter 27, he's sort of organizing the people more. We get sort of, another list of names and things that may seem a little strange to us. But the overarching idea in this section is just David was a great administrator, and he really focused on worshiping the Lord. And chapters 28 and 29, that's really where we get sort of the heart of this book, because in a way, the chronicler is speaking on behalf of David, but telling the listener, telling you and me what to really focus on. Because what David says is, he talks about, this is 1 Chronicles 28, verse 8. "Now therefore in the sight of all Israel, observe and seek out the commandments of the Lord, that you may possess this land and leave it to your kids as an inheritance forever. And you, my son Solomon, know that the God of your father, serve him with your whole heart and a willing mind, and remember that the Lord searches hearts. If you seek him, you'll be found by him. If you forsake him, though, he will cast you off forever. Be careful now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary." So again, David is exhorting Solomon, but you can also kind of hear the author speaking to us, right? Which is, we need to obey the covenant of the Lord. And, in the Old Testament, the covenant with God's people was pretty simple. It was obey the book of the covenant, the 10 Commandments and the Torah. And if they obey that and they love the Lord their God, they will endure in the land, and God will use them to be a light to the Gentiles. But if they disobey the covenant, God will remove them from the land. This is Deuteronomy 28:29. Choose for yourselves whether to experience the covenant blessings or the covenant curses, right? And that's pretty much what David is presenting to his son. Choose to obey the covenant of God. And that's very similar to how, you and I interact with the Lord today, right? It is, we can enter into the new covenant with Jesus and confess him as Lord, repent of our sin, follow him, and we can experience the covenant blessings of life with God and forgiveness and reconciliation and the hope of heaven. But if we reject that covenant relationship, we are told to expect hell forever and rejection by him, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. So the offer of faith is still the same, right? It's a covenant relationship with God. Obey the covenant, receive his blessings. If you disobey, then you will reap the outcome of your choice. But the fact that God would offer us any covenant is gracious. It is all gracious. So this isn't salvation by works. This is a covenant view of a relationship with God. So let me just sort of finish up then with when we look at Chronicles. I started off by talking about genealogies and what do we do with those, and aren't those kind of boring? And I guess what I want to point you to is when you think about the genealogies, remember this. If you go to Matthew chapter 1, you go to the very first book in the New Testament. You go to the very first chapter of the first book of the New Testament. How does it begin? It begins with a genealogy of Jesus. And so genealogies are not just things in the Old Testament. The New Testament begins with a genealogy, and it summarizes the history of Abraham's descendants and how it always points to Jesus. But what's really cool to me about the genealogy in Matthew, and why genealogies can be more interesting than we think, is when we read them carefully, we'll notice that the author is doing something really profound. And if you go to Matthew and you look at the very first sentence of the Gospel of Matthew, it says, "This is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." And then it tells the genealogy of Jesus, starting with Abraham, down to David, down to Jesus. But before he starts at Abraham and works down to David and works down to Jesus, it's interesting that he sort of plucks David and plucks Abraham, and he says, I want you to focus on these two guys in Jesus's genealogy. So why would Matthew feel like, when he was looking at Jesus's genealogy, why would he feel like he really wants us to remember that Jesus is David's descendant and Abraham's descendant? Well, the answer is because we serve a covenant God, a covenant-keeping Lord. And God made a covenant promise to Abraham that one of Abraham's descendants would bless all of the nations, and that's Jesus. And God made a covenant promise to David in 1 Chronicles 17. And he said, I'm making you a covenant promise, David, that one of your sons will reign forever. And so in Matthew, who is a Jew, who grew up reading the book of 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles, wants to explain to his fellow Jews who Jesus is, he starts off with a genealogy. And Matthew says, hey, remember that covenant in Genesis 12, where God says one of Abraham's offspring is going to bless all the nations? And remember that covenant with David, that a son of David would reign forever, and that even though David wanted to build God a house, God would build his house and establish David's throne forever? That king is here, and Abraham's descendant is here. And guess what? He can bring you into the new covenant that Jeremiah always promised us. And it's by faith in his name, not by works of the law, so that no one could boast, but by faith, that all the glory would go to God. So all that to say, I hope you're seeing, I hope this was helpful. I've been a little out of practice. I haven't done Wednesday night Bible study in a few weeks, but I hope you're seeing that maybe genealogies have more to offer. Maybe you're hopefully seeing the covenant structure of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And hopefully you're seeing that worship is really important, and that Jesus tells us that the proper worship that God is looking for is not about place, it is about in spirit and in truth, right? And so for us today, how do we apply 1 Chronicles? We want to take it really seriously that we exist to worship God. That's why we come to church. That's why we live our lives. It is about proper worship in line with God's word. So hopefully that's an encouragement to you to come to church on Sunday, not to hear a great sermon or see friends or, whatever other reasons we can have for coming to church, other than I want us to come to church because we want to worship God, because he is worthy. That's what David felt, every Sabbath, I think. And that's what the author of 1 Chronicles wants us to see. God is worthy of all of our worship. So with that in mind, love you guys. See you soon. Thanks for tuning in, and see you soon.